The morning started off like any other. I was at the kitchen table, flipping through the newspaper, the familiar smell of coffee filling the air. Kathy sat across from me, scrolling through her phone. Her expression was neutral, a face I had grown used to over the years. It was a quiet, mundane moment, something we had done countless times before. But there was something in the air that day, a tension I couldn't quite place. I sipped my coffee, glancing out the window at the empty street. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. And then, she broke the silence. "Honey," Kathy said, setting her mug down with a quiet clink on the table. "My lover is waiting outside." At first, I didn't think I heard her right. Her tone was so casual, as if she had just told me the milk was expired or that she was running late for work. I slowly lowered my coffee cup and blinked at her. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Surely, I had misheard. "You'll finally meet him today," she said again, this time with a hint of amusement in her voice. "Come over and say hi to him." My body went cold. The words hung in the air, surreal and disorienting. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of emotion that might reveal she was joking. But there was nothing. Her face remained impassive, as though she had simply stated a fact. I glanced toward the window, and there it was, a sleek, black sports car parked by the curb. The engine idled quietly, the polished chrome glinting in the morning light. The reality of it hit me hard. She wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a cruel prank or some twisted test. I turned back to Kathy, feeling the anger rising in me, my fists clenching involuntarily under the table. "If he steps on this property," I said, my voice low and tight, "he'll be in trouble for trespassing." Kathy shrugged, as if I had just warned her about a parking ticket. She stood up slowly, brushing imaginary lint off her dress. "Then I'll meet him outside," she said, her tone indifferent, as if my words carried no weight. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a loud screech. The surge of rage and disbelief coursing through me made it hard to speak. My throat tightened as I forced the words out, each one laced with venom. "If you walk out that door," I said, my hands trembling slightly at my sides, "you won't be coming back. Our 16 years of marriage will be over." For a brief moment she paused. Her hand hovered over the back of her chair, her body frozen in place. I could see something flicker across her face, maybe hesitation, maybe a flash of doubt. But it was gone in an instant. She straightened up, smoothed her hair, and met my gaze with cold, detached eyes. With a smirk that sent a chill down my spine, she picked up her handbag and slung it over her shoulder. "Watch me walk away forever, loser," she whispered, her words sharp, cutting deep into me. She turned and strode toward the door, her heels clicking softly on the floor. I stood there, frozen, my chest tight as I watched her walk away without so much as a glance back. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the house, loud in the silence that followed, final and absolute. I stood motionless, staring at the closed door, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The woman I had spent 16 years with, the woman I had built a life with, had just walked out like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. My mind struggled to catch up, replaying the last few minutes over and over, searching for some clue, some sign I might have missed over the years. But nothing came. I walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly, just in time to see her walk toward the car. The man sitting inside stepped out, tall, well-dressed, wearing expensive sunglasses. He opened the door for her like some kind of chauffeur, and she slid into the passenger seat without hesitation, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The sight made my stomach churn. The man leaned against the car for a moment, taking off his sunglasses and glancing toward the house, almost as if he expected me to come outside. His gaze lingered, challenging, as if daring me to make a move. I clenched my fists at my sides, my body tense, but I didn't move. I watched as he casually slipped back into the car and revved the engine. They drove off without a second thought, disappearing down the street, leaving nothing but the faint scent of exhaust behind. The quiet settled back over the house, but it felt different now. Heavier. I let the curtain fall back into place and sat down at the table again. The coffee was cold now, untouched, the remnants of breakfast scattered across the table like debris from a storm. I stared at it blankly, my mind numb, still struggling to accept what had just happened. 1 minute, my life was normal routine, and now, everything was upside down. 16 years. 16 years of shared memories, holidays, vacations, fights, and makeups. All of it crumbled in an instant. I thought about the way she had looked at me before she left. So cold, so detached, as though the last decade and a half meant nothing to her. Had it all been a lie? Had she been living a separate life this whole time, pretending to be someone she wasn't? I couldn't stop the questions from flooding my mind, each one more painful than the last. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to calm myself, but the anger and betrayal pulsed through me like a living thing. How long had she been seeing him? How many lies had she told me while she carried on with her affair? I felt like a fool, sitting here blindsided. I should have seen the signs. Maybe I had been too comfortable, too trusting. Maybe I had convinced myself that everything was fine, that the small cracks in our marriage were just part of the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But now, there was no pretending, no denying what was right in front of me. She had left, without hesitation, without a second thought. And I was alone. The house felt colder, emptier. I had never felt its silence so keenly before. It was as if every sound had been sucked out, leaving nothing but the echo of the door closing behind her. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the morning in my head, over and over, the pain deepening with each repetition. Eventually, I stood up, pushing the chair back under the table. I walked to the sink and poured the cold coffee down the drain, the sound of it swirling away, almost soothing in its mundanity. I leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the now empty street. Life was going to be different from now on. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the empty chair where Kathy had sat just hours earlier. 16 years of my life had been torn apart in a matter of minutes. The silence was oppressive, hanging over me like a weight I couldn't shake. My mind kept cycling through every moment, every memory, trying to make sense of it all. How did it come to this? I had noticed Kathy's distance over the past few months, but I had chalked it up to the usual stresses of life. She worked long hours, and we had both settled into the comfortable monotony of our routine. It was easy to dismiss the lack of intimacy or the occasional coldness in her tone. It never crossed my mind that something was seriously wrong. But now, every little moment seemed like a clue I had missed. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in dressing up, even when we had no plans, the mysterious phone calls, all of it rushed back, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized existed. I sat there, numb, my mind racing. I thought about the vacations we'd taken, the long weekends away where we laughed, shared secrets, and dreamed about the future. I thought about the small moments, the lazy Sundays on the couch, the shared cups of coffee in the morning, the birthdays and anniversaries. Had it all meant nothing to her? I slammed my fist down on the table, the sound echoing through the empty house. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. How could she do this? How could she throw away 16 years without a second thought? My phone buzzed, shaking me out of my thoughts. I looked down at the screen. It was Jack, my oldest friend. He was the only person who could understand what I was going through. Jack was a lawyer, sharp, pragmatic, and always brutally honest. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the call. I needed to talk to someone before the weight of it all crushed me. "Hey man," Jack's voice came through, steady and familiar. "What's going on? You sound off." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Kathy's been cheating on me?" There was a long pause on the other end. I could picture Jack's face, his brow furrowed, trying to process what I'd just said. "What?" he finally replied, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "How long?" "I don't know," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Months? Maybe longer." She told me this morning, over breakfast like it was nothing. Her lover was waiting outside in his fancy car. Jack swore under his breath. "You've got to be kidding me. After all these years?" "Jesus, man." I could hear the anger in his voice, mirroring the storm brewing inside me. "I feel like an idiot, Jack," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't see any of this coming." You're not an idiot, Jack replied, his tone sharp. She's the one who's been lying. You trusted her, like any husband would. You had no reason to think she'd do something like this. I sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. Trust. That's what it had come down to. I had trusted her, and she had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Do you want to fix this? Jack asked, his voice suddenly more measured. Or, do you want to destroy them? That question hung in the air for a moment. Fix this? How could I fix this? She had walked out without looking back, calling me a loser as if the last 16 years of my life had meant nothing. There was no fixing that. But destroy them? The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I imagined Kathy and her lover, smug in their fancy car, thinking they could just walk away without consequences. Thinking they had won. The bitterness inside me grew. Destroy them, I said, the words coming out more calmly than I expected. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. I was done being the good guy. Jack sighed. I figured as much. Listen, you don't want to do anything rash. Not yet. Let me handle the legal side. We'll make sure she doesn't walk away with a dime. She thinks she's walking away with everything, I said, my voice harder now. But she doesn't know who she's dealing with. I'll make sure she knows, Jack replied. You focus on keeping your head straight. Don't let her push you into doing something that could hurt your case. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I just can't believe she'd do this. After everything, people change, Jack said. Sometimes they just reveal who they've really been all along. You got to see it for what it is. She's not your responsibility anymore. We talked for a while longer, going over the next steps. Jack promised he'd have divorce papers ready by the end of the week. He told me to stay calm, to avoid contacting Kathy until things were in motion. I thanked him and hung up the phone, feeling a little less adrift, but still raw from the betrayal. The house felt even emptier now, the silence oppressive. I stood up and wandered aimlessly through the rooms. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of Kathy. Photos of us smiling on vacation, the blanket she always used on the couch, her favorite mug still sitting on the kitchen counter. The life we had built together was all around me, but it felt like a cruel joke now. I grabbed one of the photos off the wall, a picture of us on our 10th anniversary. We were on the beach, smiling like the world was perfect. I stared at it for a long time before finally smashing the frame against the floor. The glass shattered, scattering across the hardwood, but I didn't care. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling a strange sense of release as I looked at the broken pieces. This was my reality now. Broken, shattered, but I wouldn't stay down. I couldn't. I grabbed a trash bag from the kitchen and began cleaning up the mess, sweeping the broken glass into the bag. It was methodical, almost therapeutic. By the time I was done, I felt a little more in control, a little more grounded. Kathy had destroyed everything we had built together, but I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. I was going to rebuild, and I was going to make sure she regretted ever crossing me. I tossed the bag into the garbage and stood at the window, looking out into the darkening sky. The quiet street outside was empty now, but I knew that somewhere out there, Kathy was with him, laughing, enjoying her new life. But that wouldn't last. Not for long. Not if I had anything to say about it. That night, the house was eerily still. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, marking the minutes of my solitude. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in front of me. My mind raced as I tried to piece together everything that had happened over the past few hours. The anger had given way to cold determination. Kathy had walked out with the confidence of someone who believed she was stepping into a better life, one filled with wealth, luxury, and power. She thought she could simply move on with Richard Collins, her rich lover, leaving me behind like some discarded piece of her old life. But she underestimated me. She had no idea what I was capable of. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jack. He picked up after the second ring. Jack, I said, my voice low but steady, I need your help. You sound different, Jack replied. What's going on? I want to know everything about this Richard Collins, I said, leaning forward, my grip tightening around the phone. I want to know what skeletons he's hiding. Every misstep, every shady deal, every enemy he's made. I want it all. There was a brief pause on Jack's end. You sure about this? We're talking about digging deep. I'm sure, I said. I need to bring him down. He thinks he's untouchable, but I'll show him otherwise. All right, Jack said after a moment. I'll see what I can find, but be smart about this. You don't want to do anything that could backfire. I'm not worried about that, I said, my mind already racing through the possibilities. Just give me the information. Jack sighed. I'll start digging. Give me a few days. I hung up the phone and sat back, my mind working through the pieces. Richard Collins, a man who thought he could take what was mine. Wealthy, successful, untouchable, or so he believed. But everyone had weaknesses. Everyone had enemies. I just needed to find the cracks in his perfect facade and exploit them. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, late nights, and careful planning. Jack worked his contacts, pulling together every piece of information he could find on Richard. It wasn't long before we started to uncover the dirt. Richard's business empire wasn't as clean as it appeared. He had made his fortune through a mix of legitimate deals and backroom negotiations that skirted the edges of legality. Jack found reports of labor violations, under-the-table deals with contractors, and a few lawsuits that had mysteriously disappeared. There were whispers of blackmail and threats to competitors, but nothing that had ever stuck. Looks like your guy isn't exactly playing by the rules, Jack said one evening over the phone. But it's all been buried pretty well. No one's ever been able to pin anything on him. Then we make sure they can, I replied. We feed the right information to the right people. Let his enemies do the rest. Jack paused. You really want to go that route? He took everything from me, Jack, I said, my voice hardening. I'm going to make sure he loses it all. With Jack's help, we started leaking information to Richard's competitors, strategically placing anonymous tips with journalists and industry insiders. It wasn't long before whispers of his shady dealings started circulating in the business world. His rivals pounced, seizing any opportunity to drag his name through the mud. Lawsuits that had been settled quietly years ago were suddenly being reopened. Investigators were sniffing around his company, looking for any sign of impropriety. But this was just the first stage of my plan. Kathy. She was my next target. I knew Kathy better than anyone. I knew her strengths, her weaknesses, her insecurities. She had always been drawn to wealth, to the allure of a life filled with luxury and status. It was one of the things that had attracted her to Richard. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Kathy had grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and she believed Richard could offer her even more. She believed she was walking into a life of wealth and comfort, but I was going to make sure she ended up with nothing. I reached out to a few mutual friends, quietly spreading the word about what Kathy had done. Her betrayal, her affair. I planted seeds of doubt, subtly reminding them of how dependent she had always been on me, how she had never truly built anything on her own. It wasn't long before people began to turn their backs on her. Friends who had once been close suddenly became distant. The social circles she had been so proud of were starting to close her out. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jack called me a week later with more news. Richard's company is starting to take a hit, he said, sounding almost impressed. The investigations are picking up steam. Some of his business partners are starting to pull out of deals. Good, I said. But we're not done yet. What's next? I want Kathy to feel it too, I said, my voice colder than it had ever been. I want her to realize she bet on the wrong man. I knew what Kathy feared most, being left with nothing. She had always relied on the security I had provided, the stability of our life together. Now, she had thrown all of that away for Richard, believing he would give her more. But when his empire crumbled, she'd have nowhere to turn. I moved quickly, freezing our joint accounts before she could access any of the money. I made sure all the assets in my name were locked down, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. And as Richard's business began to unravel, I knew it was only a matter of time before their little fantasy came crashing down. The final piece of the puzzle came when Jack uncovered a personal scandal that Richard had worked hard to keep hidden, an affair with the wife of a major investor. It was enough to cause the investor to pull out of a multi-million-dollar deal, sinking Richard even deeper into trouble. The fallout was swift. Lawsuits piled up, contracts were canceled, and Richard's once thriving business was on the verge of collapse. And Kathy? She had hitched her wagon to a sinking ship. One evening, as I sat in the now empty house, my phone buzzed with a message from Jack. "It's done," the message read. "Richard's finished." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was over. Richard Collins had lost everything, and Kathy was left with nothing. The life she thought she was walking into had crumbled, and she had no one to blame but herself. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. The storm had passed, but I knew this was only the beginning. Kathy and Richard had made their choices, and now they were paying the price. Days turned into weeks, and I watched from a distance as Kathy and Richard paraded their affair like a shiny new toy. It didn't take long for their relationship to make its way onto social media. Pictures of expensive dinners, luxury getaways, and fancy cars littered my feed. It was nauseating. The two of them looked like they were living some kind of twisted fairy tale, but I knew better. Behind those carefully curated posts, a storm was brewing, and they were walking straight into it. I kept my distance, monitoring everything without ever confronting them directly. I didn't need to. Jack had already started laying the groundwork, feeding information about Richard's illegal business dealings to the press. It wasn't anything blatant, just whispers at first. A story here, a leaked document there. It didn't take long for the rumors to gain traction. Richard's reputation, once flawless, began to show cracks. Investors started to pull out. A few major contracts were suddenly on hold, pending further investigation. The empire Richard had spent years building was starting to crumble. I had also filed for divorce, making sure the process moved quickly and quietly. Jack worked diligently to ensure that everything was in my favor. Kathy, as far as she was concerned, thought she was walking away with half of everything: our house, our savings, maybe even a spousal support settlement. But she was in for a rude awakening. Jack had found ways to protect my assets, ensuring that Kathy would leave with nothing more than what she had brought into the marriage, which, unsurprisingly, was nothing. The day I handed her the divorce papers, I made sure it was in person. I wanted to see her face when reality finally caught up with her. She came by the house unannounced, as she had a few times since she left. I think, in some twisted way, she wanted me to beg her to come back. She waltzed through the door as if she still lived there, wearing an expensive designer dress I had never seen before, the kind Richard probably bought her. "So, what do you want?" she asked, eyeing me with the same smug confidence she had the morning she left. "You're not seriously trying to talk me out of this, are you?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I calmly walked over to the counter and picked up the folder that held the divorce papers. "I'm not here to talk you out of anything, Kathy," I said, handing her the folder. "I'm here to move on." Her eyes flicked down to the papers, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of doubt in her expression. But she recovered quickly, her arrogant smirk returning. "You think this will hurt me?" she sneered, flipping through the pages. "I don't need you or your money. Richard will take care of me." I couldn't help but smile at her misplaced confidence. "Richard, huh?" I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. "You really think Richard is going to be around much longer?" Her smirk faltered, but she didn't say anything. The silence hung in the air for a moment before she finally spoke. "Richard is twice the man you'll ever be," she snapped, slamming the folder shut. "He's got more money, more power, more everything. And when this divorce is over, I'll have everything I deserve." I chuckled softly. "Kathy, you have no idea what's coming to you?" She glared at me, her arrogance cracking just a little more. "What are you talking about?" I met her eyes, my smile fading. "Richard's company is under investigation, Kathy. His investors are pulling out, and his business is on the verge of collapse. You've hitched your wagon to a sinking ship." Her face paled. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to process what I had just told her. But she wasn't ready to believe it. "Not yet. You're lying," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "You're just trying to scare me." I shrugged. "Believe what you want. But don't be surprised when Richard starts distancing himself from you. He's not going to stick around when his world comes crashing down. He'll cut his losses, and you'll be left with nothing." Kathy stood there, frozen for a moment, her confidence visibly shaken. But she wasn't ready to give up her delusion just yet. She straightened her shoulders and tossed the folder back onto the counter. "Whatever," she muttered, turning on her heel. "I'm not listening to this." You're just bitter because I found someone better. I watched as she stormed toward the door, her anger radiating off of her in waves. But before she could leave, I called after her. "Kathy," I said, my voice calm but firm. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "You should sign those papers sooner rather than later. You're not going to get another offer." Without another word, she slammed the door behind her, leaving me standing alone in the quiet house. I picked up the folder from the counter and stared at it for a moment before setting it back down. It didn't matter if she signed today or tomorrow. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping what was coming next. Over the next few weeks, Richard's downfall continued to gain momentum. The press was all over his company's legal troubles, and the lawsuits were piling up faster than he could handle. The once respected businessman was now the subject of scandal, and it was only a matter of time before the authorities took a closer look at his dealings. Meanwhile, Kathy's life was beginning to unravel. She hadn't signed the divorce papers yet, probably holding out for a better settlement, but I wasn't concerned. With each passing day, her chances of walking away with anything diminished. Jack had made sure of that. One afternoon, I received a text from Jack. It was simple and to the point. "It's happening." I knew exactly what he meant. Richard's company was officially under federal investigation, and the fallout would be catastrophic. His assets would be frozen, his business partners would distance themselves, and his wealth would evaporate. And Kathy? She was about to realize just how fragile her new life really was. I sat back in my chair, staring out the window at the quiet street. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I had done what I set out to do. Richard's empire was crumbling, and Kathy's arrogant confidence was about to be shattered. The storm had arrived, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The collapse came with brutal swiftness, leaving no room for recovery. One day, Richard was the toast of the town, flaunting his wealth and status. The next, he was a disgraced man, caught in a web of his own lies. The charges were severe: fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. The headlines painted him as a villain, and within hours of his arrest, his assets were frozen. Everything Kathy had gambled her future on crumbled overnight. The cars, the luxury vacations, the lavish promises, all vanished like dust in the wind. I followed it all from the sidelines. News updates flashed across my phone. Images of Richard being led away in handcuffs, the extravagant mansion he had flaunted now under federal investigation. His investors had fled long before the hammer dropped, and those closest to him scrambled to distance themselves from the wreckage. And Kathy? She had nowhere to go. It didn't take long for her to come crawling back. I expected it. I knew it was only a matter of time before she realized that Richard had sold her a fantasy, one that had come crashing down the moment his empire fell. She had burned every bridge when she left me, but desperation drives people to beg at the doors they once slammed. It was a cold, rainy evening when she showed up at my house. I heard the knock first, soft and hesitant, barely audible over the steady drumming of the rain against the windows. I ignored it at first, assuming it was just the wind or a stray branch tapping against the door. But then it came again, louder this time, urgent, persistent. I walked slowly to the door, already knowing who it was before I opened it. There she stood, drenched from head to toe, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Her expensive designer coat, once a symbol of her new life, clung to her like dead weight. Mascara ran in streaks down her cheeks, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She was shaking, whether from the cold or fear, I couldn't tell. But it was her voice, cracked and barely audible, that revealed just how far she had fallen. "Please," she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the sound of the rain. I made a mistake. I said nothing at first. I just stood there, staring at the woman who had once been my wife, the woman who had called me a loser and walked out of my life without a second thought. Now, here she was, broken and defeated, pleading for mercy. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere else to go." The words hung between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the panic that came from realizing she had gambled everything and lost. Richard had abandoned her the moment his life fell apart, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered dreams alone. I stepped aside, letting her into the house. Not because I felt any sympathy for her, no, that part of me had died the day she walked out. But I wanted to hear her out. I wanted to see just how far she had fallen. She stumbled inside, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of her misery, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there in the foyer, her eyes darting around as if the house itself had become unfamiliar to her. I lost everything, she said, her voice breaking. Richard, he left me. Everything's gone. The money, the house, everything. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her unravel. I warned you, I said, my voice calm, almost detached. I told you that if you walked out that door, you were never coming back. Her bottom lip quivered, and she looked down at the floor, her tears mixing with the rain that still clung to her. I didn't know. I didn't know it would be like this. Of course you didn't, I replied, my tone cold. You thought you were trading up, didn't you? You thought Richard was your ticket to a better life. And now look at you. She fell to her knees then, her sobs filling the empty space between us. It was a pitiful sight, this woman who had once held her head high with arrogance, now reduced to begging. I'm sorry, she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. I was wrong, please, I need you. I can't do this alone. I stared down at her, feeling nothing but contempt. This was the woman I had loved for 16 years, the woman I had shared my life with, who had thrown it all away for a man who promised her the world. And now she was begging me for forgiveness, as if her tears could undo the damage she had done. You need me now? I asked, my voice hard. Where was this when you walked out? Where was this when you were flaunting your new life with Richard? She shook her head, still sobbing. I was stupid. I didn't realize what I was doing. I thought it was real. You thought he was better than me, I said bluntly. You thought you could have it all. Well, guess what, Kathy? You can't. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a desperation I had never seen before. Please, she begged, her voice hoarse from crying. Please give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll make it right. Just please don't leave me like this. I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory, only a deep, hollow emptiness. I had once loved this woman, but that love was gone now, replaced by something cold and unfeeling. You made your choice, I said finally, and now you have to live with it. With that, I turned away, leaving her kneeling on the floor, sobbing into the emptiness. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sound of her cries as I walked away, the rain still beating steadily against the windows. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, a strange sense of finality settled over me. Kathy had fallen, and there was no saving her now. Not by me, not by anyone. She had gambled everything and lost, and now she had to face the consequences. I lay down in bed, listening to the rain outside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing at all. The months that followed were quieter than I had imagined, yet full of a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The echoes of betrayal still lingered, but the sharp sting had dulled. I didn't need to rush anything. For the first time in a long while, I had time to breathe, time to think, and time to rebuild. After Kathy left that night, I immersed myself in the process of reclaiming my life. I returned to the routines that had once been comforting but neglected, work, hobbies, friendships I had allowed to fade during the last years of our marriage. The old rhythms felt strange at first, but as the days passed, I found solace in them. I moved back into my office at the firm. My colleagues had heard whispers about what had happened, but they gave me space, for which I was grateful. Work became an escape, a way to rebuild my confidence and establish something solid in a world that had once felt like it was slipping away. Jack and I stayed in touch, our bond stronger after all that had transpired. He checked in often, sometimes just for a beer and conversation, other times to remind me that the world had righted itself in ways we hadn't expected. Richard's sentencing had been swift and severe, and it seemed his legal troubles were far from over. A few years behind bars would likely be the least of his problems by the time everything unraveled. "Any word from her?" Jack asked one evening, sipping his beer as we sat on my porch, the warm breeze of late spring carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. "Kathy," I said, leaning back in my chair. I had long stopped thinking about her, but it still felt strange to say her name out loud. "I heard she's been struggling, moving from place to place." "She deserves worse," Jack muttered, shaking his head. "But I guess this is good enough. A little poetic justice, don't you think?" I nodded but didn't respond. It wasn't that I disagreed. What happened to her was the natural consequence of her choices. But sitting there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I didn't feel the satisfaction I once thought I would. Maybe it was because I had already won. Maybe because I was simply tired of holding on to the anger. Kathy's downfall had been as inevitable as Richard's. The life she had envisioned, full of wealth and excitement, evaporated the moment his empire crumbled. She was left with nothing, just like I had warned her. I heard things through mutual friends, through whispered conversations at the supermarket or passing by in town. She had tried to find work, but it didn't take long for people to connect her to Richard's scandal. Every door she knocked on was quickly slammed in her face. She bounced from one dingy apartment to another, each one smaller, cheaper than the last. Her dreams of living in luxury were replaced by the harsh reality of rent overdue and a pile of bills she couldn't pay. A part of me thought she might try again, come back to me one last time, begging for forgiveness, pleading for a second chance. But she never did. The Kathy I had known, the woman who once walked proudly with her head held high, had become a shadow of herself, lost and drifting. I ran into her once, months after she had left. I was coming out of a hardware store, my hands full of supplies for a project I had started at home. She was across the street, standing in front of a coffee shop, looking down at her phone. She wore a plain, worn-out coat, nothing like the designer clothes she had flaunted when she was with Richard. Her hair was unkempt, her face drawn and tired. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, but she quickly looked away, hurrying down the street. She didn't want to be seen, and I had no desire to call out to her. Whatever we had once shared was long gone, buried under the weight of her betrayal. As for Richard, the man who had thought he could take everything from me, he was serving his time, his once glamorous empire reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the business world. He would be forgotten, just another cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. And I had no doubt that prison would strip him of whatever pride he had left. One night, as I sat in my quiet home, I found myself thinking about Kathy again. Not in the bitter, angry way I used to, but with a kind of distant sadness. She had been part of my life for so long, and yet now, she was like a ghost. Her choices had led her to ruin, and while it would have been easy to hate her, I found that I couldn't anymore. I had moved on, rebuilt the life she had tried to destroy, and I was content. I had no regrets about how it all played out. In the end, I had taken control, and that was enough. One evening, as I stood in my newly renovated kitchen, the sun setting outside, casting a warm glow through the windows, I felt an odd sense of peace wash over me. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they had faded. Life, with all its twists and turns, had continued, and I had come out on the other side stronger, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. I no longer checked the news for updates on Richard's case. I didn't ask friends if they had seen or heard from Kathy. That chapter was over. The storm had passed, and I had survived it. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally live in peace. The quiet of the house no longer felt empty. It felt like home. I sat back in my chair, taking a deep breath, and let the tranquility settle in. There was no more pain, no more anger, no more need for revenge. I had done what I needed to do, and now I could simply enjoy the life I had reclaimed. The world outside kept moving, but for me, everything was right where it needed to be. I had found my peace amidst the ruins, and that was all I had ever really wanted.